On June 22, 1940, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France signed an armistice with Germany. It was the same carriage in which Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had it hauled out of a museum for the occasion. In 10 months, his armies had defeated Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Britain now stood alone against him. In Berlin, almost no one believed that would last the summer. The generals expected a British delegation within weeks. Hitler expected it too. The German High Command had no plan for what to do if Britain kept fighting, because no one at the top thought they would have to. And the assumption was not foolish. The arithmetic said Britain was finished. The British Army had escaped from Dunkirk. Over 338,000 men lifted off the beaches, but almost everything else stayed behind in France. Roughly 2,500 guns, around 65,000 vehicles, hundreds of tanks. The soldiers came home, and their weapons did not. For a time, some infantry battalions in England drilled with rifles from the last war, and some Home Guard units had no rifles at all. Berlin was also reasoning from a track record. In 1936, Germany had marched into the Rhineland, and Britain did nothing. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria, and Britain did nothing. At Munich that September, Britain signed away Czechoslovakia's frontier defenses to avoid a war. Ribbentrop, who had been ambassador in London, had told Hitler for years that the British were tired, divided, and would always choose a deal over a fight. He had been wrong in September 1939, but now France was gone, and the argument looked stronger than ever. What Berlin could not see was that Britain's own leadership had run the same numbers and reached almost the same answer. On May 25, 1940, the British Chiefs of Staff handed the War Cabinet a paper called British Strategy in a Certain Eventuality. It concluded that if the Royal Air Force survived, the Navy could probably prevent an invasion. If the RAF was destroyed, the Navy could not hold the Germans off forever, and the Army was too weak to stop a landing. Britain, it said, could not win the war at all without the full economic and financial support of the United States. The American ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, was cabling Washington that Britain's cause was hopeless, so Berlin and London were reading the same board. The difference was what happened next inside the British government. Between May 26th and May 28th, 1940, with the Dunkirk evacuation just beginning, the British War Cabinet argued in secret over whether to explore peace terms through Mussolini. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, pressed for it. Churchill, Prime Minister for barely 2 weeks, resisted, and on May 28th he put the question to the wider cabinet of some 25 ministers. He told them that if Britain's story was to end, it should end only when each of them lay choking in his own blood upon the ground. The room backed him. The peace option died in that meeting, 4 weeks before Germany began waiting for it to be taken up. Berlin knew none of this. What Berlin heard instead were echoes. On June 17th, the day France asked for terms, a British Foreign Office minister named Rab Butler spoke with the Swedish envoy Bjorn Pritz in St. James's Park. Pritz cabled Stockholm that Butler had said no opportunity for a reasonable compromise should be missed, and that Halifax had sent word that common sense, not bravado, would guide British policy. British intelligence intercepted the telegram. Churchill demanded an explanation, and both men denied it. But that was exactly the kind of signal German diplomats in neutral capitals were listening for. It told them the peace party was real. They could not know it had already lost. Nearly everything known about that summer's decisions on both sides comes out of paperwork like this: cabinet minutes, intercepted telegrams, staff diaries, directives. Records of that kind are the raw material of War Shelf, a library of short books on the Second World War, each one a single story taken all the way down through roughly 10,000 pages of documents. The link is in the description. On June 30th, 1940, General Jodl, Chief of Operations at the German High Command, wrote a memorandum on the continuation of the war against England. It laid out a siege, air and sea attack on shipping, on factories, on the Royal Air Force. A landing would come only at the end, and Jodl described it as a death blow. delivered to an enemy already beaten. Final victory over England, he wrote, was only a matter of time. On July 13th, Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary that the Führer was greatly puzzled by Britain's persisting unwillingness to make peace. Hitler saw the answer in Britain's hope in Russia and counted on having to compel her by force. That single diary entry contains the whole story of the next year of the war, the puzzlement, and the conclusion that would come of it. 3 days later, on July 16th, Hitler issued Directive Number 16. Its opening line stated that since England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still showed no signs of willingness to come to terms, he had decided to prepare and, if necessary, carry out a landing operation against her. The crossing would run on a broad front from around Ramsgate to west of the Isle of Wight. Preparations were to be complete by mid-August. Germany was giving itself 6 weeks to improvise. From nothing, the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. On July 19th, Hitler spoke to the Reichstag at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. He created 12 field marshals that evening and made Göring Reichsmarschall. Then he turned to England. He said he felt obliged to make one more appeal to reason. He could see no reason why the war should go on. He spoke, he said, not as a vanquished foe begging favors, but as the victor. There were no terms in the speech, no proposals, no conditions, no procedure. An appeal, and behind it a threat. The answer came 3 days later by radio, and it came from Lord Halifax, the same man who had argued for exploring terms in May. Hitler's only appeal, Halifax said, was to the base instinct of fear, and his only arguments were threats. Britain would not stop fighting until freedom was secure. In early August, the Luftwaffe dropped copies of Hitler's speech over England as a 4-page leaflet titled A Last Appeal to Reason. Britons collected them from their fields and sold them at charity auctions for the Red Cross. So the siege began, and it rested on an intelligence picture that was wrong in almost every direction that mattered. Germany had no agents in Britain. Every spy the Abwehr sent across, by parachute and by boat, was captured, and many were turned around and run back against Berlin by British counterintelligence. The German picture of England was assembled from newspapers, radio broadcasts, neutral gossip, and aerial photographs. Britain, meanwhile, was quietly reading portions of the Luftwaffe's own coded radio traffic. The Germans never knew. On July 16th, the same day as Directive 16, Colonel Joseph Schmid, head of Luftwaffe intelligence, issued his appreciation of the Royal Air Force. He put fighter command at about 900 fighters, called both the Spitfire and the Hurricane inferior to the Messerschmitt 109, and estimated British fighter production at 180 to 300 aircraft a month, a figure he expected to fall under bombing and shortage of raw materials. He judged RAF command inflexible, and he concluded the Luftwaffe could achieve a decisive result if the campaign used the favorable weather months July to the beginning of October. There was the deadline, written into the German assessment itself. Britain had to be broken by autumn, because after autumn, the weather closed the window. The reality ran the other way. Under Lord Beaverbrook's new Ministry of Aircraft Production, British factories were turning out roughly 500 fighters a month through the summer, close to double Schmid's estimate, and holding steady, while German fighter production ran near 300. Britain outbuilt Germany in fighters for the entire battle, and the RAF that Schmid called inflexible was operating the most advanced air defense system in the world, a chain of radar stations feeding a filter room at Bentley Priory, which directed fighters onto incoming raids by radio. Schmid saw the radio control and read it as rigidity. The Luftwaffe's planners expected to break the fighter defenses of southern England in about 4 days, and the RAF as a whole in about 4 weeks. The main offensive opened on August 13th. Through late August, German intelligence kept subtracting British losses from its estimates, and by August 17th, Schmid was telling commanders that fighter command was down to some 300 serviceable aircraft. British records for that period show over 800, with hundreds more in storage. Week after week, German aircrews crossed the Channel and met a force that, on paper in Berlin, had already ceased to exist. At sea, the other arm of the siege was doing real damage. From July to the end of October, U-boats sank 282 Allied ships, nearly 1.5 million tons, in what German crews called the happy time. Britain's supply situation deteriorated. It did not come close to forcing terms. And behind the air battle, the invasion itself was coming apart in the planning rooms. The German Navy had been gutted in Norway that spring, losing 3 cruisers, 10 destroyers, and 6 U-boats. For a channel crossing in September, it could offer a heavy cruiser, a couple of light cruisers, and a handful of destroyers against the Royal Navy's home fleet. Admiral Raeder said a broad front crossing was impossible and wanted a narrow one near Beachy Head. Halder answered that from the Army's point of view, a narrow front was complete suicide. He might as well, he said, put the troops through a sausage machine. Neither service believed the other could deliver. Both were right. The invasion fleet itself was some 2,000 river barges towed into Rotterdam, Antwerp, Ostend, Calais, Boulogne, and Le Havre, many fitted with concrete floors and improvised ramps. The RAF bombed them nightly. By then, Hitler had already looked past England. On July 31st, at the Berghof, he told his commanders that Britain's hope lay in Russia and the United States. If Russia dropped out of the picture, America too was lost to Britain. Russia's destruction, Halder recorded, must therefore be made part of this struggle. Spring 1941. The failure to understand why Britain fought on had produced its answer, and the answer was Barbarossa. September 7th. The Luftwaffe shifted its weight to London. That evening the docks burned, and at 8 o'clock the code word, Cromwell, invasion imminent, went out to British home forces. In some villages, church bells rang by mistake. The landings never came. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe flew its largest daylight attacks on London and was beaten off. Churchill spent that afternoon in the underground operations room at Uxbridge, and by his own account asked Air Vice Marshal Park what reserves remained. Park answered, "There are none." Every squadron was in the air, and it was enough. 2 days later, on September 17th, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. In October, it was pushed to spring 1941, kept alive on paper as political pressure. On December 18th, he signed Directive Number 21, Operation Barbarossa. Britain had not won the war that autumn. It could not win it, only refused to lose it, and it was going broke doing so. In November, the British ambassador in Washington told American reporters plainly, "Britain's broke, it's your money we want." Lend-Lease followed in March 1941. That was the bet the British Chiefs of Staff had named back in May, and it paid. The autumn Germany had waited for came and went. Between July 10th and the end of October, the Luftwaffe lost 1,887 aircraft and around 2,700 aircrew dead. Fighter Command lost 544 pilots, more than 1 in 6 of the men who flew, and nearly a fifth of those pilots were not British at all. Poles above all, men from the countries already conquered, fighting on when the arithmetic said they should not. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, still holding to the answer he had given Halder the previous July, that Britain fought on only because it hoped in Russia. Colonel Schmid, whose figures had promised victory by October, was never called to account, and served on to the end of the war. In Berlin, the security services had prepared a handbook for the occupation of Britain, with a list of 2,820 people to be arrested on landing. It was printed in the summer of 1940, and it was never used.